Okay, today I'm going to attempt to talk about the self. And I'm going to do that using the language framework of tarot. At least the first 8 or 9 cards of the tarot deck. I'm going to do this explicitly using the frame of tarot, but I'm going to reference Carl Jung's book, Aion, which was published, I think, in the early 1950s. In reading Aion recently, the first, say, third of the book is a description of the self. And Carl Jung refers to the self as something larger than what we identify with as I, and makes a distinction between those things. The self is a totality of our conscious, unconscious, and superconscious mind, the structures within those, let's say, levels, and also our connection over, as that's ourself, is larger than ourself in that it connects with the collective unconscious. Now, I've heard people run through contemplations. There's a brilliant book by Ken Wilber called No Boundary. And the question that begins the book is, who am I? Or what is I? And lots of people, let's say, who are cut off from themselves, identify I as something that resides behind our eyes, up in our head somewhere. This is I. And if you consider that a little bit deeper, I might actually be not just my head, but my heart. You know, my mind, my feelings. Maybe I am, maybe the boundary between I and not I is the skin, right? So we're housed in a body, and we've got all these processes and things going on, and maybe I is that. We're limited in this physical body. And then he goes on to ask the question, well, what if I is actually our relationships with things and people as well? And that opens up a larger field. Now, it's a difficult book to read because it puts you pretty deep into trance pretty quickly, and it bends your mind with some of these questions. I'm not going to go too deep into that concept. It's a very worthwhile read if you're exploring questions of what is the self. But I want to draw parallels between Jung's book Aion and the tarot. Now, I believe actually the first third of the book is based on tarot. We know that Jung lectured on the subject in the early 1930s, but he never wrote specifically much about it. So I'm going to start with the first card in the traditional deck, and that is the Fool. This deck, by the way, is the Pamela Coleman Smith deck. It's the deck commemorating the woman who painted the Rider Waite deck, which is the standard tarot deck. What I'm doing here is I'm turning through the unbound book of psychology. I want to approach this in rational terms. I'm not casting any cards here at this point. And I'm just looking at the sequence and structure of the deck. And the first card is the Fool. Now, when you look at the Fool card, it's, interesting to see here the little white dog. And we have the Fool with his luggage basically tied to a stick, the white rose. And you may notice he's about to step off a cliff. And the sun is behind him. If we consider this image a little bit, we might even say that the Fool is androgynous. So I think it could be both male and female. It doesn't really matter. It represents a person. And if we look at this at the journey of life, this is an individual who is being born. Basically has no idea what they're getting into. They're about to step off a cliff. It's freaking cold all of a sudden, but they have everything they need with them in order to get through this journey. And tarot is sometimes called the Fool's Journey. because the Major Arcana is the story of our development through life and our encounters with various archetypes and levels, and it's representative of the different psychological levels and processes that we go through. So after the Fool is born, we encounter the first two archetypes, that is Mother and Father, and those are the cards, the Magician and the High Priestess. Now you'll see the Magician has the four elements, the four tools on the table. This is masculine energy, or traditional, I'd say traditional isn't the right word, archetypal male energy, as the master of the physical realm, or the Imperium. We've got the earth, water, fire, and air elements on the table. Those four tools, magical tools, correspond to the four minor suits in the tarot deck, or the four elements, or the four major personality types. Then in the number 2 card, we have Mum, who's the High Priestess. Okay, so when children are young, you may recall this, you may have thought or attributed magical powers to your parents. They are everything to a young child as they're coming into the world, and they can express themselves positively or negatively, and these are where all the Mother and Father archetypes reside. You'll notice in the High Priestess card, we've got the 2 pillars, Boaz and Joachim. Those are the pillars in the Kabbalah, the right wing and the left wing. You can see in behind her, actually, the red pomegranates are representative of the Sephira in the Kabbalah. So we've got some deep references here. The moon is the connection with the unconscious, with the fluid realms, with the dream world, with there's earth element, but there's elemental connections in there that are intuitive, and part of the female archetype is having deeper connections to this field than the male archetype. The male archetype is more connected with material, and female archetype connected more with intuition and emotions. Now, as the Fool progresses, we encounter next the larger archetypes of masculine and feminine in the world that we're in. Jung would describe these as the syzygy. Okay? I'm gonna back up a little bit, because I'm gonna parallel Aion. Now, still looking at the Magician and the High Priestess card, I'm going to talk a little bit about the inversions that are possible in tarot and in processes in our psyche. So in tarot, a card has a different meaning whether it's upright or whether it's upside down. And so in negative expressions, if the cards are upside down, they would have, negative isn't the right word, evil's not the right word, they would have less functional expressions, let's say. So the Fool has the same capacity. The card can appear upright or inverted. And when inverted, there's a function here in our psyche that Jung calls the shadow projection. So as we start to individuate a little bit, we have this thing that happens in our unconscious where we can't see our own limitations or foibles or negative character traits, and we can be triggered or set off by those traits that we see in other people. And Jung called this shadow projection. And during the formation of our basic years, our relationship with our mother and our father, we start to integrate or figure things out. Like, once we learn how to walk, we spend an awful lot of time and energy learning how to walk. We fall, I don't know how many thousand times, on our butt, on our face, we bang into things. But once we figure out how to walk, it's pretty much unconscious, right? And that becomes part of our unconscious nature. We also bury things, and we start to build unconscious structures, limiting beliefs, things that we identify with that may not be true or may not be real, but we develop strategies at this age in order to cope with life. And some of those strategies, whether they're emotional or behavioral, get established in the unconscious. We could call it a little corner of the unconscious, but imagine it like a little pocket or a little a peg that you kind of imagine. These things are in a bag and they're just hanging on the peg, or they're filed in a particular file folder, maybe we could call it, that come out when we get regressed as adults. So something triggers us, we might have a negative behavior pattern that we fall into, we regress a little bit, or we can project that crap onto other people. The next level, what Jung calls in the book Aion, the syzygy, I don't know exactly how you pronounce it. We have the emperor and the empress, or the empress and the emperor, 3 and 4. These are the larger male and female patterns in the world that we live in. Beyond mother and father, the nature of male and female. Jung calls these the Anima and the Animus. And it's a level beyond the shadow projection functions of the lower orders of cards into more archetypal male and female. And he suggests that men have a female anima, which is, I almost think of it like a nemesis, where we can hang all our crap on a female figure in terms of our relationships with women. For women, he suggests that there's a male animus, and in relationships for women between men, that animus can manifest itself almost as a nemesis or a much more complicated shadow. Now, based on my experience, I think that that structure can either be neutral or gender fluid. Let's say that this nemesis, this complex, can be projected onto other people if it's not functional, and the gender doesn't matter. So I've seen men project their dissociated nemesis onto other men. I've seen women project their completely dissociated nemesis onto a woman. And this is bigger than the shadow kinds of projection functions that Jung talks about. I think shadow projection is more behavioral and on a smaller scale, but this projection of anima, animus, this nemesis, can be projected onto a third party, and it's not gender specific. During his time, if we look back at Freud was obsessed with sex, as we all know, and he thought every issue that human beings had was a result of sex, or Oedipal complexes, etc., etc. Jung evolved a little bit more, and it kind of got beyond that, and I think there was still hang-ups on male and female identities, and at that time in society, pretty strong distinctions in terms of men's roles and women's roles in society. We hadn't quite got to the place that we get to today. I'm a little more open. If our unconscious mind is gender fluid, that's all fine and dandy for me. So the number 5 card is the Hierophant. So we've got male and female structures in Emperor and Empress, the larger scope male and female archetypes. And there's a lot of them. The Hierophant card, which is the teachings of society, the mores, the rules, the traditions, the rituals of our society that are whether it's our tribe or our community or our church or our institutions. These are the kinds of teachings that we get. This is the Fool, as he or she is maturing, who is encountering society and the structures of society itself. Now, those are the raw parts. Those are the raw parts of self. And as we get older, those parts, we first learn them. We know these 4 stages of learning, right? The first stage is you don't know what you don't know. It's unconscious incompetence. The second stage of learning is you know what you don't know. It's conscious incompetence. And then as we practice and get better at whatever stage we're at, it's conscious competence. And then we reach a stage where we're at unconscious competence. So as we're developing, we're going through these layers and building up our unconscious mind in whatever kind of structural way that our life kind of unfolds. There's 2 things. The nature and nurture debate here needs to be addressed, I think, because we come in with certain biological tendencies. We're pre-wired with certain, let's say, set points or temperaments that are in our, maybe they're related to hormones in utero, or developmental stages, or maybe it's our soul, and it has to do with the energy of coming into this body. I don't know all of that, but then there's also our environment, and this long and tired debate about nature and nurture really goes away as soon as you have kids. If you have more than 1 kid, you can see immediately that their temperament is very, very different. There is an onboard hard wiring towards dealing with the world. But as the fool on his or her journey goes through life, the issues of life get buried in the unconscious, things we learn that may or may not be constructive, that's the foundation of our self, okay? Now, this is the next card, my favorite card in the tarot deck, and that is the Lover's card. And it's profound. If you know tarot, and maybe you have a different deck than the Rider-Waite, I would encourage you to check out your particular tarot. And I use this critique as a way of evaluating the art of a particular deck to determine, in my mind, how much I think that the artist actually knew when they're painting a replica deck of tarot. The structure here is extremely important. You'll see this is reflective of the Garden of Eden myth. And you could look at the angel figure as God. We've got the tree of knowledge of good and evil behind Eve. We've got the tree of life behind Adam. Okay, so that's one layer. Look at where the male figure is looking. He is looking at her, and she is looking at the angel card, or the higher self card. Now, the higher self is always our next level of psychological, spiritual development. It's always the next level of our potential. So as a child, teenager, I've got teenage kids, and they're hanging out with their tribes. My daughter's part of a sci-fi tribe, and they all watch certain shows and have certain language and rituals. They've identified with each other as having common ground, let's say. And if I'm looking at this as an example, human beings evolved beyond tribal communities over the last few thousand years. There are still some tribal structures that are out there in the field of consciousness. A good example is sort of the family structure of organized crime. We think the mafia is a tribal honor code kind of system. There are certain codes that my teenage kids have in their tribe for behavior and things like that. But the higher self is always them individuating beyond that. That's the next level of their development. And as an adult, as an individuated adult, there is always another layer of consciousness that we can go to. That is our next level of developmental psychic potential, let's say. So the figures in the card, we have the conscious mind is the male figure in the card. The unconscious mind is the female figure in the card. And then we have the superconscious, or the higher self, in the angelic figure. Now, of course, behind is the sun. That's the source of life and the field of energy. And the angel, as we can imagine, is connected to the larger field, the collective unconscious. So when we start to realize that, there is an unconscious, We have the capacity to develop a relationship with the unconscious that can connect us to our higher self. This is an integration process that has to begin at a certain stage of development, where we need to kind of come to terms with the nature and nurture that we have on board, and that there's stuff probably going on in our unconscious that just happened kind of as it happened. And we get then next into, before I jump there, I'm going to put two cards side by side. The Devil card, this is one of the so-called scary cards in the tarot. If we look at side by side with the Lovers, we can see a parallel structure. And it's notable from numerological construction here that this card is exactly 9 more than, so the number 15 is 9 more than the number 6, and that's notable in cyclical progressions that are important in tarot. So this Devil card is a representation at a higher level of abstraction, or let's say a deeper level of meaning. Take a look at where the figures in the card are looking compared to the Lovers. So in the Lovers, the higher self is looking down on the conscious and the unconscious mind. In the Devil card, the Devil's looking straight ahead. It's disconnected. But we can't disconnect from that potential, that larger self. And our conscious minds here, in the male figure, he's not looking at the female figure, so there's either no connection to the unconscious or a negative connection. We can't get away from our unconscious mind. We're chained to it. But if we don't have a good relationship with our unconscious, then we can't evolve to the next level. And this card, the Devil card, often represents things like addictions or attachments or, unreasonable ties to ideas. I would say we see this in narcissistic behavior, where a narcissist can't admit that they make mistakes. But unconscious crap, happens. The ego cannot function properly, can't accept that it makes mistakes, can't acknowledge that the unconscious exists. It projects its crap onto the world around it. Okay, so the next card, the number 7. Now, we start to get into Jung's integration or individuation process here in the 7 card. You can see the Charioteer. That is the I we identify with as self. And the 2 lions in the card, sometimes depicted as 2 horses in different decks. The white horse, the light horse and the dark horse, or the white lion and the black lion, goes back to Platonic Plato, the philosopher Plato's story of the chariot. And this is our soul, our I, the self-I, driving the chariot, and having to integrate unconscious conflicts. Because if we've got parts of ourself that want to go in different directions, the chariot's going to go nowhere or could crash. Okay, so there's a process that we start to go to as we begin the process of individuation, of integrating internal conflicts. A great example of this, and you may find that you notice people say this in the next couple of days, because people say things like this all the time. So you may notice when it pops up in conversation. Part of me wants to do this, but the other part of me thinks this. Now, the notion of unconscious parts of self go back well before Freud, and actually, if we really trace it, I think we can trace it right back into, the classical Greece. There's an awareness that there are different parts of ourself going on. One of those parts, they can be mapped out. They can be mapped out, say, with the chakra system, where there's 7 layers, and we could address whether there's integration or disintegration at each of the layers. Can be looked at in terms of Kabbalah as well, where at the different layers of the Kabbalah, there's 7 layers, but 10 Sephira, there can actually be conflicts between the 2 sides or the polarities on a horizontal level. Geburah and Gedula, for example, can have conflicting agendas and conflicting expressions, but ultimately they want to serve the higher self or the soul. So in the Chariot card, we see the self driving the chariot. If that card came up upside down, for example, in a reading or a reflection, I might say to the person, look, there's something unconscious in terms of parts going on that are preventing you from getting where you want to go or achieving a goal, because they have different agendas, or at least on the surface they have different agendas. Now, once we master that level of self-development and we can integrate some of those conflicting parts and align ourselves internally, then we can actually move into really expressing our true nature. Now, sometimes I would call I would suggest that in the Chariot stage and in the number 8 card, the strength stage, we are in our teenage years and we're testing our boundaries. The strength card is really about having internal alignment, unconscious alignment with self. That's building on the not only the knowledge of the structure of our relationship with our unconscious and with our higher self, but being able to really tune that and go through that integration or individuation process. By the time we get to the strength card, we have that individuation nearly complete, but we have to be tested a little bit, let's say, and we have to be able to prove it to ourselves, not to anybody else. We then reach the reflection stage. The Hermit card is the number 9, completing the first wheel of tarot, followed by the 10 card, which is actually the Wheel of Fortune. So I won't go into the wheel too much, but the Hermit card here is the fully individuated self who has the wisdom and the strength to exist in the world as an individual that is connected to the source power and can shine that light on the rest of the world, because believe it or not, much of the world has not reached that level of psychological development, having completed the process of individuation. Now, coming back to the book Aion, this is the first third of the book. Jung doesn't mention tarot in any capacity, but he talks about the self. And the self is the totality of all of that. It's our conscious mind, it's our unconscious mind, it's our superconscious connection to the collective unconscious, and all of those boundaries or encapsulates the self. Now, there's one more part of self that I'm gonna come back to. I'm gonna go back to the Fool card at the very beginning. If you remember, there's a little white dog. We're not in Kansas anymore, Toto. The little white dog is a representative of the daemon. Not demon, but daemon. And we go back to classical philosophy again, and Socrates talked about the demon or the daemon as a, let's say, a spirit messenger or a spirit ally that assists us in tasks or assists us in life. It's a component of the self that runs messages, I think, between the conscious and the unconscious and the superconscious. So I see the unconscious more as a field. We can actually think of this process in terms of the hero's journey. So if you read Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, there's a call to action. And one of the examples he uses is the story of the princess and the toad. The princess is playing near the edge of the dark forest, which represents the unconscious mind, and she's playing with her marbles, and she drops her ball or one of her marbles into this pool or pond, and she can't get it. And the frog comes to her and says, you know, I can get your marble for you, but you have to give me this boon. You have to do me this favor. And she said, whatever you want, I'll do it for you. And so he goes and he gets her marble. And that ensues or begins that heroic journey of the princess being drawn into the adventure in the dark forest, which is representative of the unconscious mind. So we don't know what we're getting into in the dark forest, but there's all kinds of trials and quests and things that we've got to deal with, where we're doing battle with, a demon, or solving a puzzle or a riddle, or, confronting our fears. A good example of this confrontation of fears in the unconscious mind is in the original Star Wars trilogy, in The Empire Strikes Back, where Luke Skywalker is on the planet with Yoda doing his training, and he goes into the cave, which represents the unconscious mind, and he does battle with his projection of shadow, which is dressed as Darth Vader. And there's a lightsaber battle, and when he strikes Darth Vader, the mask comes off, and he recognizes that it's himself. He's recognizing that the enemy he is perceiving is actually a projection of what his own internal things are going on. That's the battle in the dark forest. That heroic journey is the process of integration. And the little white dog, the daemon, is like the frog in Joseph Campbell's story of The Princess and the Frog, that bridges or that coaxes the development of the self along in its process. The dog is or the animal is a bit of a guide. Socrates called this the daemon. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we can develop relationship with that part of ourselves to very useful and magical effect in another video. So this is my map of the self, or at least the overall initial structure of the self, and the development of an individuation of the self using tarot as a descriptor and Jung's Anima as say, a rational backup for that process. There's one more thing I want to say. We actually have maps of the unconscious, that field, that dark forest. There are maps of the dark forest. And it's not a map in the conventional sense, but I really want to stress that we understand what the energies that exist there are. We understand what the challenges that exist in those domains are, because other people have gone there before us. And we have mythology and individual myths that tell us the kind of developmental challenges, psychic challenges, personal growth challenges that we experience as human beings as told in myth. Okay, but the very simple vocabularies or maps of this unconscious field are the 7 chakras, or the Kabbalah, or the 7 planets of astrology and the 12 signs of the zodiac, and the progression of the house systems. Those are vocabularies built around mythological structures, and I really believe that those can be used to great utility in that integration process and understanding the deeper, darker, dark forest as we go through on maybe not our fool's journey in life, hopefully not, but our hero's journey. Shannon Douglas signing off for today. Hope you enjoyed this.